This is not the story of a political execution. It is the anatomy of a psychological dismantling, a methodical and public vivisection of a soul before the body was offered to the blade. In a common, unmarked grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, amid the anonymous lime-dusted corpses of a revolution devouring its own, lay the headless body of a woman once known as Marie Antoinette, Queen of France and Navarre. Her end was not merely a death, but the horrifying final act in a protracted ritual of humiliation designed to strip away not just her crown and her life, but her identity, her motherhood, and her humanity itself. She who had been the radiant center of Versailles, the shimmering symbol of absolute monarchy's opulence and divine right, was systematically reduced to a number, prisoner 280, a vessel for the collective hatred of a nation, and finally, just meat for a common pit. The story of her last months is the story of a journey into an abyss, where the true horror was not the sharp, swift violence of the guillotine, but the slow, grinding sadism that preceded it. It is an account of how a society, in its feverish pursuit of liberty, can engineer the total annihilation of a single human being, proving that the road from a palace to a mass grave is paved not with cobblestones alone, but with calculated cruelty and the weaponization of despair. To understand the Queen's fall, one must first understand the ground she stood on, which was already crumbling beneath her feet long before the first revolutionary cries echoed through Paris. She arrived in France in 1770 as a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess, a political pawn in a dynastic marriage intended to seal an alliance between the rival houses of Bourbon and Habsburg. From that first moment, she was an outsider, a foreigner forever branded L'Autrichian, the Austrian woman. This was her original, immutable sin. In a kingdom simmering with decades of fiscal mismanagement, social inequality, and the burgeoning ideals of the Enlightenment, the public needed a focus for its discontent. The monarchy itself was a nebulous concept, but the Queen was a tangible, glittering target. Her perceived extravagance, whether real or wildly exaggerated by libelous pamphlets known as libelless, became a symbol of the crown's indifference to the suffering of its people. The infamous, apocryphal phrase, "let them eat cake," never passed her lips, but its persistence in the popular imagination speaks to the success of this character assassination. Her flaw, then, was not simple greed or malicious intent, but a profound and tragic inability to comprehend the seismic social and political forces gathering like a storm front over France. She was a creature of the Ancien regime, a product of Rococo refinement and the hermetically sealed world of courtly etiquette, and she possessed no language to communicate with, nor framework to understand the raw, chthonic rage of a populace starving for both bread and justice. She retreated into the curated fantasy of the Petit Trianon, a private world of pastoral make-believe, while outside its gilded gates, the real world was preparing to burn her effigy, and then the woman herself. The point of no return, the single act that irrevocably sealed her fate and that of the monarchy, was not a declaration of war or a political decree, but an act of desperate, ill-conceived escape. The flight to Varennes in June of 1791 was the fatal miscalculation from which there would be no recovery. For months, the royal family had been virtual prisoners in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, subject to the whims of the National Assembly and the constant surveillance of the increasingly radicalized Parisian mob. The decision to flee was born of fear for their lives, for their children, and for the future of a crown they believed was divinely ordained. They sought to reach the royalist stronghold of Montmedy, near the border, where they hoped to rally loyal troops and negotiate with the Assembly from a position of strength. But the entire affair was a tragicomedy of errors, a testament to their complete detachment from reality. They traveled not in a discreet, swift carriage, but in a large, conspicuous, and slow-moving berlin, laden with luggage and attendants, a rolling spectacle of royal privilege in a countryside on high alert. Miscommunication, delays, and a catastrophic underestimation of the revolutionary fervor pervading even small provincial towns doomed the enterprise. When the king was recognized in the village of Saint Menehould, a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet rode ahead to the town of Varennes in Argonne, where the local militia was alerted and the bridge blocked. The capture of the royal family was not a dramatic battle, but a pathetic, humiliating anticlimax. Their arrest transformed them overnight from begrudged constitutional monarchs into undeniable traitors. By attempting to abandon their people, they had proven, in the eyes of the revolutionaries, that they were enemies of the nation. The long, silent, funereal procession back to Paris, through towns and villages filled with hostile, accusing crowds, was not merely a return to captivity. It was the beginning of their march to the scaffold. The descent from that moment was a slow, deliberate strangulation of dignity. Imprisoned first in the Temple Tower, a grim medieval fortress in the heart of Paris, the family was subjected to a life that was a grotesque parody of their former existence. The physical confinement was absolute, but the true torture was psychological, a campaign of attrition waged by their jailers. The first great blow was the formal abolition of the monarchy and the trial and execution of her husband, Louis XVI, in January 1793. From her window, Marie Antoinette could hear the vendors hawking the papers that detailed his final moments, and she was forced to mourn in a cell where guards watched her every move, their presence a constant, invasive violation of her grief. Yet this was merely a prelude. The architects of the terror understood that to destroy the queen, they first had to desecrate the mother. In July 1793, they came for her son, 8-year-old Louis Charles. Now, the titular king Louis XVII to the royalists, was ripped from her arms. The sounds of his cries and her frantic pleas echoed through the temple, a scene of raw maternal anguish that her captors observed with cold indifference. He was handed over to the care of a radical cobbler, Antoine Simon, whose task was not to care for the boy, but to break him, to re-educate him in the virtues of the Republic by erasing every trace of his royal upbringing. This separation was the opening salvo in the most depraved chapter of her persecution. Before this, she had endured the loss of a crown. Now she began the process of losing her mind. The psychological warfare escalated with a diabolical precision. While she languished, isolated from her remaining family, her captors worked on her son. Through a combination of intimidation, manipulation, and alcohol, they coerced the child into becoming the chief witness against his own mother. He was made to sign a pre-written statement filled with fabricated accounts of treasonous plots, but the core of the document was a charge of stunning depravity, that his mother had sexually abused him, committing incest to corrupt the future king. This accusation was the masterstroke of her persecutors, a charge so vile it was designed to strip her of her final public refuge, her status as a mother, and cast her as a monster outside the bounds of human sympathy. This manufactured testimony would form the centerpiece of her eventual trial. Her suffering was not confined to the emotional realm. Her captors engaged in constant, petty torments. Guards were instructed to remain in her cell at all times, never leaving her a moment of privacy. They played cards, smoked their pipes, deliberately blowing clouds of smoke into her face, their casual contempt a daily reminder of her powerlessness. The outside world intruded only to bring more horror. Following the September massacres, a frenzied mob murdered her closest friend, the Princesse de Lamballe, subjected her body to unspeakable mutilations, and then paraded her severed head on a pike. They brought this gruesome trophy to the temple and held it up to Marie Antoinette's window, a ghastly, silent message from the streets. She fainted at the sight, a merciful, temporary escape from a reality that had become a waking nightmare. The final stage of her descent began on the night of August 2nd, 1793, with her transfer to the Conciergerie prison. If the temple had been a cage, the Conciergerie was a tomb. Known as the antechamber to the guillotine, it was a damp, fetid, lightless labyrinth beneath the Palais de Justice, a place for which few prisoners ever returned. She was installed in a small, stone cell, previously occupied by a common criminal, where the straw mattress was infested with vermin and the walls seeped with the chill of the nearby Seine. Here, Her isolation was nearly complete. A screen offered the barest pretense of privacy from the 2 guards stationed inside her cell around the clock, their shadows dancing on the damp stone in the flickering lamplight. Her health, already fragile from stress and grief, began to collapse. She suffered from constant hemorrhaging, a condition that was both physically debilitating and deeply humiliating under the unblinking gaze of her jailers. She was prisoner 280, her name erased, her identity reduced to a number on a ledger. For 76 days, she existed in this penumbral state, suspended between a life that was already a memory and a death that was a certainty. She was given nothing to do, nothing to read save for a book of prayers. She spent her days pacing the few feet of her cell or sitting motionless on her stool, her face a mask of stoic resignation, a queen still, if only in her refusal to grant her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. The point of no return, the event that formalized her destruction, was her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was not a legal proceeding. It was a 90-minute piece of political theater, a show trial whose verdict was written before the first witness was called. The proceedings, which should have taken weeks, were crammed into 2 frantic days and a night session, from October 14th to the 15th. She was brought before the tribunal, gaunt and pale, dressed in a simple black mourning dress, her prematurely white hair a stark testament to her ordeal. The charges against her were a chaotic melange of treason, conspiracy, and fiscal profligacy, accusations that she had plotted with foreign powers, squandered the nation's treasury, and orchestrated massacres. The evidence was flimsy, consisting mostly of hearsay, rumor, and the coerced testimony of terrified former servants. For most of the trial, Marie Antoinette maintained a remarkable composure, answering the prosecutor's questions with a cool, regal clarity that seemed to frustrate their attempts to portray her as a hysterical fiend. Then came the trial's lurid centerpiece. The prosecutor, Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, a man whose name would become synonymous with the terror's bloodlust, introduced the incest accusation. He read aloud the statement signed by her son. A wave of shock and revulsion passed through the courtroom. For the first time, Marie Antoinette's stoic defense shattered. When a juror pressed her on the matter, she rose to her feet, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a profound, righteous anger. She turned away from the judges and addressed the public gallery, specifically the women seated there. "I appeal to all the mothers present in this room," she declared. "Is such a crime possible?" It was a moment of pure, unscripted humanity, a desperate appeal to a shared bond that transcended politics. For a brief instant, a current of sympathy flickered through the crowd. But it was not enough. The machinery of the terror was implacable. The trial continued through the night, and in the early morning of October 16th, 1793, the predetermined verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was death. The hours that followed were a masterclass in calculated degradation, a final, systematic stripping away of every remaining shred of dignity. Returned to her cell, she was not left to contemplate her end in peace. She was allowed to write a final letter to her sister-in-law, a moving testament of faith, forgiveness, and love for her children, which her jailers would confiscate and never deliver. At dawn, the executioner, Henri Sanson, and his assistants entered her cell. They ordered her to change her clothes, but offered her no privacy, forcing her to disrobe behind her thin screen as they watched. They took her black mourning dress and made her put on a simple white chemise, the stark, functional garment of the condemned. Then came the most brutal part of the preparation. One of Sanson's assistants grabbed her hair, now stark white and thin by her ordeal, and roughly sheared it off with heavy scissors, the locks falling to the filthy floor. This was not merely a practical measure for the guillotine. It was a profound act of despoiling, a symbolic scalping of her femininity and royal identity. Next, they bound her hands. Instead of tying them in front of her, as was sometimes done, they wrenched her arms painfully behind her back, the coarse rope cutting into her wrists. As a final humiliation, they tied a rope leash around her neck, as if she were an animal being led to slaughter. She had expected, as her husband had been granted, the relative dignity of a closed carriage for her final journey. Instead, waiting for her in the courtyard was a tumbril, a common, open-topped wooden cart used for hauling agricultural goods, now repurposed for hauling human beings to their death. The sight of it was another calculated blow, a final public statement that she was no better than the lowest criminal. The journey to the scaffold was the culmination of her public shaming, an agonizingly slow, one-hour procession through the heart of the city that hated her. Hoisted onto the jolting, springless cart, she was forced to sit on a rough plank, her hands bound behind her, unable to brace herself. The painter Jacques-Louis David, a fervent revolutionary, sat on a nearby balcony, sketching her with a cold, clinical eye, capturing her rigid posture and gaunt face in a final, merciless portrait. The streets were lined with a vast, screaming mob, a sea of faces contorted with a primal fury. They had come not just to witness an execution, but to participate in it. They hurled insults, calling her the Austrian whore, jeering, spitting at the cart as it rumbled past. The sheer volume of hatred was a physical force. At one point, the cart jolted so violently over the cobblestones that she nearly fell off, a moment of profound vulnerability that only incited more laughter from the crowd. Midway through this ordeal, her body, racked by illness and terror, betrayed her. She had to humbly beg the cart driver for permission to stop and relieve herself in a secluded corner of a courtyard, a moment of supreme indignity that reduced the former Queen of France to the most basic, pitiable human state. Throughout it all, she stared straight ahead, her face a pale, impassive mask, refusing to look at the crowds, her silence and stillness her only remaining weapons against the deluge of hate. This was not a procession. It was a mobile pillory, her final penance performed not before God, but before the ravenous judgment of the people. When the tumbril finally lumbered into the vast expanse of the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, the guillotine stood waiting, a stark, geometric silhouette against the gray October sky. It occupied the space where a statue of her husband's grandfather, Louis XV, had once stood. The crowd, estimated at over 100,000, roared with anticipation. She descended from the cart with as much composure as she could muster, her head held high. As she mounted the wooden steps of the scaffold, her vision perhaps blurred by emotion or the morning light, she accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner, Henri Sanson. In a final, surreal reflex of a lifetime of courtly etiquette, a ghost of the world she had once inhabited, she turned to the man who was about to kill her and uttered her last words. Pardonnez-moi, monsieur. Je ne l'ai pas fait exprès, pardon-moi, sir. I did not do it on purpose. It was an apology from a queen who had been stripped of everything, a moment of cosmic irony, so profound it was almost poetic. She was then quickly seized, forced onto the bascule, the plank that tilted forward, and her head was locked into the lunette, the crescent-shaped brace. For a brief second, there was silence. Then Sanson pulled the rope. The weighted blade, the national razor, fell with a deafening thud. An assistant grabbed her head by its shorn white hair and held it aloft for the crowd to see. A massive, sustained roar of Vive la République erupted from 100,000 throats, the sound washing over the square in a triumphant, bloodthirsty wave. The revolution had consumed its most prized symbol. Her body was unceremoniously loaded into a simple wooden coffin and taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, where it was thrown into a common, unmarked grave, the quicklime beginning its work of erasing her even from the earth. In the immediate aftermath, the relief among the revolutionary leaders was palpable. The death of the widow Capet, as they called her, was seen as a necessary exorcism, the final severing of the nation from its monarchical past. Her children remained in the temple's custody. Her daughter, Marie Therese, would be the family's sole survivor, eventually released in a prisoner exchange. Her son, the tragic child king Louis Charles, would die 2 years later in his prison, his body ravaged by neglect, tuberculosis, and abuse. The terror, far from being sated by the queen's blood, would only accelerate, consuming many of the very men who had condemned her before it finally burned itself out. The power vacuum left by the monarchy's collapse would eventually be filled not by a committee of virtuous Republicans, but by an emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, who would reestablish a court of even greater imperial splendor than the one Marie Antoinette had known. The unmarked grave in the Madeleine Cemetery remained a forgotten plot for over 2 decades, a testament to the Revolution's desire to utterly erase her. It was only after the Bourbon Restoration in 1815 that her remains, identified by a garter and an examination of the skeleton, were exhumed and given a royal burial in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the traditional necropolis of French kings. The legacy of Marie Antoinette is a study in paradox. For 2 centuries, she has been a canvas onto which others have projected their own narratives. The monstrous, decadent queen for revolutionaries, the noble, tragic martyr for royalists, the frivolous fashion icon for popular culture, the misunderstood feminist victim for modern revisionists. Her story has outlived the political squabbles of her time, its horror resonating far beyond the fall of a single throne. Her gruesome end serves as a chilling reminder of the terrifying power of symbolism. She was destroyed not for what she did, but for what she represented. She was transformed from a human being into an idea, the idea of aristocratic corruption, and that idea was ritually slaughtered in the public square. Her ordeal demonstrates how quickly the ideals of liberty can curdle into the license for cruelty, and how a mob, convinced of its own righteousness, can become an instrument of unspeakable sadism. Her story reminds us that beneath the grand, sweeping narratives of history are the fragile, breakable bodies of individual human beings. Power is always temporary, and glory always fades, but the methodical deconstruction of a single woman's humanity, carried out in the name of progress, echoes as a permanent and terrifying warning through the ages.